the third or fourth in the series of masters and this one is about getting to the point in your research. We're going to go through 2 case studies today, and I hope help you understand the position of master's research and what's required of you, and then the rest is kind of fine-tuning. So anyway, let me get on with it and say that our goal for today is to help you plot the course from your research design to a credible ending. Our agenda is we're going to overview the research frames and how to plot one. And then we're going to overview argument and what is meant by that. And then I'm going to go through a couple of case studies about how it was done from one set of ideas to another. So let's start with an overview of research. And I wanted you to notice right away that these 2 next slides are circles, because one idea leads to another, like stepping stones, which always take us back again. So this is an iterative thought process. We start with an idea or an issue or a question, and then that determines, well, I think this is going to be the purpose of my research. And there's some kind of underlying theoretical or conceptual or epistemological ideas on which we're based. And that is often determined by our field. And when you read other people's research, you'll encounter their theoretical positions and you can decide, but they're very personal. These are the personal ideas that we have about how our world works. So we take an issue, we have a reason, we put that on top of how we think the world works. Those 3 things together lead us to our methodology. Now, some master's research is done as research. You go out and you collect data. Other master's research is done as an overview of what I would call archival data. It's things that have gone before, written records that are already in existence. So you might not be collecting the data, it might be archival, but one way or another, you have to analyze it to see how that bit of data affects your issue, your purpose, and the reasons you did this research. So it's a circle. Now, the circle can be drawn differently depending, again, on the context of your field. And so we might see more often at the doctoral level something that looks like this. This is also very practical. If you are in a practical, professional kind of field, then you may have to do research based upon some real issue that's happening. So your topic then, you would say, oh, I want to study, let's say, leadership. And I would go out to a local situation and I would see what are the indicators that there are issues with leadership, which would lead me with my literature to a problem statement. So I could have another bubble up there that would say literature, and literature plus indicators equals problem statement. And that then leads me to the purpose. And with that, I would have questions or hypotheses about this topic. And then this time, theoretical stance comes a little later because I apply my questions and everything that I know about the topic in the first half of this circle over a theoretical stance, which leads me to a methodology, to my data collection, my data analysis, and back to my topic. Now, what I want to say about these 2 circles is that your particular circumstance will determine to some extent, these are good circles, they're good basic circles, but you might have your bubbles in slightly different ways. So this is a research framework designed by a student, and this student was an education student. So, and it was a master's project where she was studying the effects of problem-based learning on a curriculum. And Her research question had to do with problem-based learning, and her epistemological theoretical underpinning was constructivism. So she saw those three things as going together very closely and leading her to her methodology. And because she wanted to see how something worked, what its effect was on a curriculum, it was action research. She looked then at how she would measure what would happen in her groups and how she would reflect on that. And that's a pretty standard action research cycle. So what matters is not so much how you put together the pieces of your drawing, but that you can draw them out in a way that allows you to discuss it. So I can look at these drawings and I can say, well, this and this and this lead together. They lead to this methodology, which will be taken care of this way. And you can put that together and you can then write in a short paragraph or two what it is you are doing. That's very important. It allows those who read your writing to be clear that you know what it is you're doing. Now, that's research frameworks. Now, how does that impact or go with this idea of argument? I talked about argument a little last week, but I want to continue to clarify it because it couldn't be more important. Argument has 4 parts. You have a claim, you have some evidence, there's a connection between the evidence and the claim, therefore you see a connection and you find that connection significant. For instance, if we were going to look at this weighing scale, the right side is heavier. The evidence is that we can see that the right side is lower. The idea then is that there's a connection between the weight and the lower side. Therefore, we would expect that would be something on the lower side that would make it go down, that would be the important structure. And whether or not you agree with this example, these are the 4 kinds of sentences that you come up with when you are building a credible claim. Then people look at these 4 things and they say, is it credible? Do I believe this? And if not, what would I do differently? So let's look now at some real examples of research. So a student who worked with reading disabled students observed that most of the students with reading issues had a problem with reading out loud and with phonetic decoding. However, there was a smaller percentage who could read out loud and who could do phonetic decoding, but they had no comprehension. So the student starts the topic question by asking, what's the difference between these 2 groups? Now, go to the literature. It's always the next step. So the literature showed a consistent finding of at least 2 types of reading disability, those that had issues with phonetics and those who had a more semantic issue. Previous research showed that 85% of the reading disabled showed a right hemisphere orientation. Since speech is in the left hemisphere process, it was consistent with the problem in phonetic decoding. So the first question that needed to be addressed was whether or not the remaining 15% had a left hemisphere orientation, and previous literature found that it might. All right, so that's what our literature is showing. And we had a hypothesis then, thought this is what we were going to find, that the reading disabled students with the right hemisphere orientation would have an issue with phonetic decoding, but those students with the left hemisphere orientation would not. And the second hypothesis was that reading disabled students with the left hemisphere orientation would not have the issue with phonetic decoding. All right, so we have 2 ideas, and we just have to decide on a design. The first step was to design a task that depended on phonetic decoding. So rhyming was chosen. Unless you can say the words, you cannot say whether or not they rhyme. So you have to be able to phonetically decode rhyming, especially with things like buy and tie and bone and gone. They look, one looks but isn't rhyming, etc. So the second step was to design a task that depended on meaning. So word pairs were developed for that. So you have two tasks, words using the same words but in different ways to see what happened. The data showed that the right hemisphere reading disabled were significantly lower than the control group of normal readers, and that the left hemisphere reading disabled and the left hemisphere people on the rhyme task. These right hemisphere reading disabled people did not differ from the control group on the semantic task, but the left hemisphere people were inferior to both the right hemisphere and the control group. So that's a kind of convoluted way to say the findings were that most students are taught reading with a phonetic decoding approach. They convert the printed word to its sound, and from that sound get the meaning. 85% of reading disabled could not convert the printed word to its sound, but were still able to get the meaning. 15% could convert, but did not get meaning. So how does all of this go into an argument? So that was a lot. That was what you would read if you were reading a journal article, because it had a lot of stuff in there that was more than the argument. The argument is these four things. Disabled readers will differ in whether they can sound out words and whether they can understand the meaning of the words. The data from this study demonstrate that some students understood the meaning but could not sound them out, while others could work out the sounds but not the meaning. And the significance is that therefore it's important that teachers judge both abilities so as not to leave some disabled students behind. Okay, so here's a discussion. See if you have any comments. Did you see all the parts? As I was going through the steps, did you see the parts? Did they make sense? I'll let you say yes or no to that. All the parts were clear. Does the argument have the parts? And were they enough? Did the results seem credible? Or would you have wanted to see more? So you can have a research design and the argument can be credible because of it or not. If it's not credible, it's because the author left something out. So was the argument credible? And are you satisfied that it had all the right stuff it needed to have? Just, of course, from our little conversation. Briefly, but it seems credible. Exactly, briefly, but it seems credible. Now, here's the thing. If you can do it small, like this, then you have a credible, and then what you're doing is you're expanding on that. So one of our master's students came to us and said that her supervisor had said that the point of the master's degree was to show that you understood how to do research. This person made it point. Yes, they understood the parts of the research. Yes, their argument was credible. Assuming that their written documentation of all of this was coherent throughout and they didn't argue with themselves or say things differently in one section or another, this person would pass. Whether or not the research had enough, was big enough or robust enough or had enough literature or all these other things that go into whether it would be a doctoral study, it's satisfactory as a master's level. And then you're left to the background of your school and how much they expect. As long as you have a final document or two from your school, you know kind of what's the realm of their expectations. You can meet that realm and you'll be fine. I have the slides to this up in the handout, so if you need them, I did leave you, the slides seem to be getting cut off by the, but at least by my screen. But there is this next one I took from ProQuest, and I gave you the link if you wanted to go check it out yourself. So our second case study, the topic is about relationships. I try to do case studies from different fields, and this one was from history. So topic is a relationship between servants and the household that employed them in the period of 1837 to 1901 in London, specifically as it pertained to those employees who were taken to court accused of theft or infanticide and their effect on the households. So, what's this about? Well, the literature centered on historical treatise that life in London in the second half of the 1800s, specifically drilling into the pressures of maintaining the status quo from upstairs to downstairs. When the downstairs workers were transient and had their own lives and didn't necessarily live in the big houses anymore, weren't necessarily born to the task, etc. So life is changing in the relationship between the gentry and those they employ, and during that period of time. So that's historical background. And it was looking at that pressure as to how it played out in the courts, specifically the Old Bailey, and specifically two different kinds of crime. One was crime of theft, and the other was crime of concealing a live birth, or in fact killing the child after a live birth in order to maintain your employment. So it was an archival examination of the records from the Old Bailey courthouse, and the methodological consideration was historiographies. So building a biography from a series of court records taken together. And looking for the commonalities and then drawing conclusions. So that's the design. What were the results? Well, the results were that domestics participated in a range of theft practices, and that servants who were accused of concealment or infanticide reported that they were trying to maintain their secrets so as to safeguard their reputations, their jobs, and chances to marry. So in other words, the people who committed crimes had various reasons for doing so, and the level of the crime varied. Now, the interpretation of this was that there's similarity in the cases of employers against staff for both. These are very different crimes, aren't they? One is you steal my brooch, and the other is you have a baby without telling me and you killed the baby. Very different crimes, but there was more similarity in the court cases than differences, which suggested that both were consistent with the scrutiny of servants and domestics in order to keep the deviant behaviors in check and ultimately to cut back on the servants and domestics' ability to act on their own or for themselves. So wanting to keep them in line. Now, what's our argument here? So that's our research. We did these two studies of two different kinds of crime. We found some similarities. So what argument is this making? Well, it's saying that civil suits brought against servants during the last part of the 1800s in London were efforts to maintain the status quo. Now, that's our claim. So it's a big claim. What's our evidence? That the historical accounts analyzed from court records of the time demonstrated, that's the warrant, similarities with the accused, whether or not they were being tried for theft or infanticide. Both types of cases are evidence of the upper classes working to maintain control over their domestic staff. So what's the point? The point is you're working your mind. These are thought experiments, aren't they? Whatever we're doing, we need to be able to put the circles together of these are how my ideas fit the literature, fit all the things at the beginning. And then I need to, at the end, be able to build a solid argument. And the path in between that is dotted, if you will, with tracking down literature, tracking down data, putting your ideas together. But the goal is to take a research framework and to build through the process of working it to build an argument. If you can do those two things and you can write coherently, you are passing the degrees that are that will get you your master's degree. So Annalene says that it also makes sense. The two parts of it make sense. And would there be anything else you could add? I was struck with, again, it's masters are less data. You work with less data. It's a difference. Oftentimes, a master's degree and a PhD can almost be the same design, but the master's just has less that they have to go through. And so I wondered if this would hold through across a different type of crime or et cetera. You might push the data if you were going to do the same kind of thing for a PhD. Or you might bring it in outside evidence and triangulate that evidence with this. But you see, for your degree, Annalene, you can keep it kind of a single track. And as long as you do that single track well, you should be fine. Now, it's a good time to open up. Are there questions? Good. I'm glad it helps. Does it lead you wondering anything I should answer? And as she's maybe typing in a question, Q&A time. If you are watching by recording and you have a question, you can write for extra resources about that question by emailing Margie, M-A-R-G-I-E, at doctoralnet.com, and she will help you find in our resource files the resources you need to further understand the part of the process that's hanging you up. Research consistency matrix. How important is it to do? Well, that's really two questions to me. First off, when you say research consistency matrix, are you thinking about a particular tool? Is that a title? Or are you thinking about, in general, analyzing the consistency across different pieces of research? And I was told to do one. And you were told to do one like you had to turn it in? Or you were just told to do one to help yourself out? Oh, that's interesting. All right. So how important is it to do? It's important. You have to turn it in. I'm assuming that they have a matrix for you. If not, let me just send on This, I typed in research consistency matrix just to see what was out there because it's a phrase that's slightly vague. Let me just say a couple things. First off, research for a quantitative study. I thought yours was a qualitative study. Was I wrong about that? How important is research consistency? Vitally important. The single thing that causes any thesis or dissertation not to pass is inconsistency between one part and another all the time. Your words don't go together right. You're saying one thing in one paragraph and something what reads to the person who really knows how these words go together, it appears you're doing so. Oh, sorry about that. So being able to know what goes where, how to be consistent, very important. If your university has a particular, any kind of matrix is all very useful because they help you sort, disaggregate, and then reaggregate. And that's just a useful ability to think, and it's also a very useful tool. So do it. I'm sure you take it very seriously. I'm sure you're going to learn stuff about how one part doesn't go together with the other part as much as it needs to. But I did look up research consistency matrix and I found a wide range of options. And for anyone who's watching, that particular assessment matrix is probably useful because I would call it a rubric about judge your own work as to whether it's exceeds average, attains minimum, or it's deficient. And then you can kind of decide for yourself where your master's thesis is. Did that answer your question? I personally think very useful. And if you have to turn it in, then there's no question about it. Somebody felt it was needed. So, short and sweet webinar today. Hope it was helpful to all of the masters, and it will be part of our master's box set that we will have soon, and other things that you need to know if you are in the 2017 year. After that it will be old news, but we have an app that is coming for both iOS and Android. It will be out in September. Through your phone, you'll be able to easily access your MastersNet tools and webinar notifications. Also, next week, the Master Series continues with a discussion on abstracts, because an abstract is how you get people to read your work. So it's very important. And the week after that, we're going to go through presentations because you will need to present what you do to other people, and there's some easy things that make it better for you to do. And sometimes people have presenting is not easy. So we'll help hopefully make it easier for you. With that, thank you all who coming by recording. And I'll turn this off and then people in the room will be able to ask more questions afterwards. Somehow, I'm going to have to. Isn't that interesting? It isn't letting me go to the recording tab to stop the. Big marker isn't letting me stop the recording. There we go. Okay, recording ended. Oh, very good. Very good.